I'm Addison Brazil. Grief Club, the podcast, starts now. Hey, Grief Club, before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to share a little bit of Grief Club mail and a challenge that I got from a member in Grief Club. The mail says, "Hey, Addison, thank you for everything that you're doing in the grief space. I didn't know who you were, but I was given your gift of a book unexpectedly after my mother passed. I honestly cannot imagine this grief process without your words and checking in with you week to week. I've been listening to the podcast and I absolutely love it. I can't believe that you take the time to dive deeper on each of the weeks in the book with your friends who get it. I think it would be amazing if you read an excerpt from the book so people can see just how powerful it is and how easy it is to check in on a weekly basis. From a new friend who gets it, Lily." All right, Lily, I'm going to take your advice and share a little bit of First Year of Grief Club. So this episode is based on week 22, and here's an excerpt from the book. Week 22. Death can be something that we can't stop thinking about, or at times want to talk about too much. I've been at a dinner with friends and noticed myself bringing the conversation back to death and my loss. It can come up at very difficult moments and quickly become something we don't want to talk about at all. Honoring a grief journey gets to come with personal boundaries with both ourselves and others. Are there times when you felt like if you had set a boundary, maybe you would have avoided becoming overstimulated, unnecessarily upset, or ending up too far down the rabbit hole of an existential crisis by managing this? And then I share a quote. In grief, some common areas that can require boundaries are your time, energy, privacy, emotions, home, and belongings, and finances. But a good place to start is to consider areas with friends, family, or colleagues where you have felt some sort of tension or rub since your loss. And that's from our friends at What's Your Grief. I then, as always, prompt you to do a conscious emotional check-in, to choose one word in this moment to describe how you are feeling physically, one word mentally, and one word emotionally, which we do every week to start the podcast. And then I ask, with awareness of yourself in this moment, how do you want to take action? And my offering for the week on boundaries goes like this. What boundaries would you like to set? Our confidence in boundaries can be built by front-end loading or preparing for when they might come up. Create a phrase that you can use to respectfully make others aware of your boundaries. Here's what I do. My father died of suicide, and people's natural curiosity can lead to me answering questions that are triggering and would require grounding techniques afterwards. So when it starts to go there, and I don't want to go there, I say something like this. As part of my grief journey, I've set a boundary around talking about blank too much. Do you mind if we stop here? So start to think about, what are your boundaries with yourself? When I start to blank, I will blank. What are your boundaries with others when it comes to your grief journey? And then I leave grave space for you to think about and reflect on boundaries. Today, we are jumping in with quite the expert, a trauma-informed therapist, Meghan Riordan Jarvis. Welcome to the show.
Addison, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this for weeks.
Me as well. So the first thing I like to do is to check in with the guest. So if you would be down to take a deep breath with me. In one word, how are you feeling physically right now?
I'm like neutral.
Say tired.
Yeah, neutral.
In one word, how are you feeling mentally right now?
Excited.
I'm gonna say intrigued. And one word, how are you feeling emotionally right now?
It's not one word. Up and down. Up and down. Yeah.
Raw, if I'm being honest.
Ooh, raw. That's a good one.
So we are checking here, and the first thing I like to do is just allow you to kind of honor your journey openly with the listeners. And so taking a few minutes to kind of walk us through who Meghan is and how you got to show up in the world the way you do today. You know, that easy little question that takes 2 minutes.
That easy little question. So, my form, I have a couple of like formal titles, and one of them is that I'm a trauma-informed therapist who specializes in grief and loss. And that's sort of where my world has landed for the past 20 years. That work of helping clients who come into my office, many of whom are struggling more with like the complicated grief that we read about, people who've experienced childhood trauma. And the way that I got to that office is that way back. So when I was 8 turning 9, there was a death of a beloved teenager in my life. He drowned in the small town that I grew up in while I was at the beach alongside my family, but we didn't realize that he had drowned. And that marked my family in a really significant way that I had no idea about until I landed in my own therapist's office after a breakup when I was 22 years old. Walking into that therapy office, I knew a few things. Like I always took things like breakups and hardships and friendships. I seemed to be impacted by them much more significantly than other people. I had a very strong sense of being other that like wasn't positive. I'm not going to call it low self-esteem, but I had surprisingly, like I knew them to be somewhat distorted thoughts about myself based on the actual facts of myself. And I landed in this therapist's office kind of like, hey, I'm just sad about this breakup. And she was like, okay. And we're going to talk about other things like your family of origin. And I was like, nope, they're not the problem. And I spent about 10 years in therapy and in group therapy, unwinding and learning what it meant to be a child of trauma. And trauma being a bad event that happens, right? Like COVID is a trauma. But being traumatized, meaning the negative meaning that lands inside your body and sort of sets up shop there. So I loved being a trauma therapist. I loved all the extra learning. I loved the independence of sitting in my office. I loved my clients. In 2017, my dad died of small cell cancer. He was sick for about a year. The diagnosis that he got was very serious and grave. And so for the year that he was ill, I understood that he was dying. And so I participated in his death by visiting him and having conversations with him. And so while his death was really hard and sad, it wasn't traumatizing. I mean, there were elements of it that were really difficult, but it didn't leave me with a like, what is the world now? My mom died 2 years later in her sleep when I was on vacation with her in her house. And I had my kids there and my dog and my husband. And that was the opposite. That was absolutely immediately traumatizing. From, a clinical standpoint, I had what became PTSD. I had those thoughts almost instantly. Things like, it's my fault that she died, ruminations that began. And I have to say, it was really humbling. I ended up checking myself into the same facility that I have sent, dozens of clients, because I had the metacognition of knowing what was happening to me and knowing that, 1 week of therapy, the interventions that I would use it was almost like when ice forms across a windshield, if the ice doesn't touch yet, you have some hope of scraping it, but the minute it really locks in all the way across, like you're going to be there for a while trying to heat it and scrape it off. And so I knew that was what was happening to me. When I came out of treatment, which was an incredible experience for me, I mean, both clinically to experience the treatments that be on the receiving end of the treatments, but also to understand that there was still some trauma left in my system that hadn't really been addressed, and to sort of get a perspective that nobody is coming into a grief experience with nothing. There's no tabula rasa. Everybody has something that that their brain is and their body is sort of remembering and bringing into this new experience. And so just being able to like embody that and understand that really was a shift for me. I took 6 months off of work. I went back to work for about 2 months, and then COVID hit.
Mm.
And so it was a very strange, like I felt totally other again, the way that I had back when I lived in trauma. I had this new sensation of like, oh, I've been living on this weird island where everything feels bad and hard. And now because of COVID, there's people joining me on this weird island where everything feels bad and hard. And people were not necessarily grieving deaths from COVID, but everyone seemed to be experiencing loss and not really understanding, having any sort of basic education about what their physical symptoms were. I was hearing about brain fog and irritability and all the things, all the classic symptoms of grief. And people be feeling really confused, not being able to name their experience. And so I was doing a lot of writing at that time. I joined a book club. I wasn't doing a lot of individual therapy for myself. And the writing became a thing. And I ended up, this part of the story is like long and complicated, but basically through like the generosity of Zibby Owens, who's now my publisher. She's this extraordinary force in the book world. Before she became a publishing company, she gave me access to an editor through a fellowship. And I started to work with someone and turned my narrative, my understanding of myself into a book. And that's coming out in December of this year. I'm doing all the cover and copy edits, and it hasn't really stopped the like desire to talk to a larger audience about what I know they don't know, which is most of what I do when I get on my soapbox is explain the neuroscience behind what happens when you experience a loss, particularly a sudden loss, and what those symptoms look like. Brain fog, not being able to eat, not being able to sleep, and also offer the sort of somatic response therapies that help with those things. And what has been really interesting and sort of happened backwards is the people who are the most interested in having this conversation are people who are in the workplace trying to get folks to come back to the office. And I've been unbelievably heartened by this. It's been a partnership of like, I have reached out to some companies and said, I offer this conversation. And now companies are like, wait a minute, are you the lady who talks about that stuff? And the reason I find it to be so rewarding is that we're in this space, sort of post-ish COVID, where companies, organizations, people with MBAs are trying to figure out why it's so hard to go, quote unquote, back to work. And I come in and say, nobody's going back anywhere. We've lost too much. And grievers get that immediately. They know that like the minute your person dies, that chapter is over, and you may bring some parts of your life into the next chapter, but it is a different color. That pathway is made of a different brick. And so I've been in these, I love the organizations that have been hiring me. I love the conversations. I even love the people who are like, oh, I don't need this conversation, because it's the macro level is if you're able to talk about this at work, you are going to let people feel safer coming back into the office. They're going to feel validated and less crazy, and they're going to trust you that it's okay to come back in here. If you keep saying they need to come back to work, they're not going to be able to explain it, but there's going to be a breach of trust. Those folks are also people who have husbands, sisters, cousins, friends who have experienced actual death loss and want to show up as a supporter and don't know how because we're so not grief informed. So even when they're not sitting in the meetings expecting to talk about work stuff, much of what they take from it is for their personal lives. And so I have these trainings that I do with my business partner, and people nod their heads and they say, can you come back and talk to us again? And then I get 15 personal emails like, hey, can I ask you a question about my daughter, I hadn't thought about it until we talked. And you can appreciate the kind of like rewarding feeling of I'm doing work differently, but I'm able to sort of offer more to more people. And I don't panic about it as much anymore. In the early days, I did, but I really think we have to get people better grief informed so that it doesn't feel like this private experience. I mean, it's not a private experience. It is a completely universal human experience that binds us all together, probably in the most like true and holy way.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't keep it out of workplaces. We can't keep it out of schools, but most importantly, we can't keep it out of our lives. So that's what I do on an everyday basis. I'm on podcasts like yours. I'm writing a clinical book right now that's 25 essential questions about grief and loss answered. I have a novel that I just wrote where the heroine experiences a profound loss. I'm just all the things, any way that somebody wants to talk to me about. I do a lot of consulting to companies. Some of it is training. Some of it is just sort of talking to the C-suite about how do we adapt current policies. I mean, I'm talking about grief and loss all day, and I'm kind of happier than I've ever been, which is maybe perverse, but true.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that you're doing that. And one thing that really came up for me, and I almost heard my own words as you were saying it, but I think that COVID really was this sort of grief worker Avengers unite moment, because I had the exact same thing where it was the first time, even though we were all isolated, where it was the first time I no longer felt isolated by this sort of secret grief and grieving that I was kind of going through silently, especially being in my 20s, all the way through, and nobody else was really talking about it. And then suddenly everybody is like trying to put words around this thing, and I'm just sitting there laughing, being like, grief, you're grieving. It's grief. Like, this has been wrapped around the neck of everything I have felt or done or been a part of, in all of these years. And so it was weird how at such an isolating time I felt a great sense of community, and that, like you, which is when I started writing my book, like, it was time to say something, and it was time to sort of offer more to the world. So I absolutely love that. So I have to ask you this question because I ask every guest: if a child walked up to you or someone who didn't know what the word meant and asked you sort of in one sentence, what does grief mean? How would you respond?
So I love this question, and I have a really simple answer. Is grief is the feeling inside your body when you lose something you love. That's it. It's just the energetic response inside, and kids understand energy. It's inside of here, that feeling and sensation that you get when you have lost something that you love. And that's my definition, the one that I use in my book. It's just, loss is something that happens to everybody. Grief is the energetic response to loss. And it can show up in all kinds of ways. And it's important to know that. But if a kid came up and said to me, what is grief? That is what I would say.
And if they then asked, well, then what's complicated grief? And there's a little bit of asking as well here. What would you say to that?
So there are all these clinical words that I think are helpful. Like I did, sort of a year of reading all of the grief theories and so to a kid, if I said what is complicated grief, to a kid, I would say it's grief that feels stuck and is really hard. The grief doesn't begin to feel better the way it does for some other people. It feels stuck. And so you might have to go see a doctor for them to give you some treatment, some ideas of how to like just get it unstuck. That's how I would say it to a kid. What I would say about complicated grief is, people have different definitions, and I almost want to, shy away from nailing down the language specifically, because where all the language leads is to the question of, so when do I have to go see a therapist? When do I need to get treatment? And I don't love that question, Because I really think that if we did a better job with grief in general, if we were more grief informed as a culture, we would have a much different answer to that question. The question at the root has this idea to it that it's a bad thing to go seek therapy, and you can hear it. When do I have to go? Whereas like if you said to me, like my elbow, has been hurting for a couple of weeks, I would say, go see your doctor. Maybe you need PT. And you would be like, yeah, maybe I do, because I played tennis. There isn't a sort of stigma associated with it. And so what I say to folks is complicated grief to me is probably a kind of grief that is a step beyond what a coach or your friends or connection and exercise. It goes beyond what you're going to be able to shift on your own. And luckily, there are a whole bunch of people out there who are interested in trauma who would be able to come in and give you a dozen ideas of how to shift the energy so that it doesn't stay stuck inside your system. So when people say, when do I go see a therapist? I say, call someone the minute that question occurs to you, because you don't have to, so there are these new diagnoses, or not so new, that have shifted about, how we're actually going to define it. And one of the things that put people into an uproar is this idea that, after a year, if you have these symptoms still, you fall into this category of a diagnosis. And the people who feel like, well, it's a good thing because then you can get treatment paid for. And then there are other people that say, are you kidding me? Like everyone is still grieving after a year. What do you mean? Why wouldn't I still be yearning for my dad? I lived with him for 40 years of my life. All of that aside, if you went back to the notion that grief is one of the hardest kinds of energies that we have to carry, anyone who's been through it will tell you it is a full contact sport. I couldn't move my torso. I couldn't lift myself out of the bed for months without like a little bit of help, If we can acknowledge that that is the truth, and say there are people out there who can give you a dozen ideas that you can just go home and try. Some might be as simple as journaling, and that might not have occurred to you. And some might be as concrete as a treatment like EMDR. But if any of them help you, why would we wait until 12 months to see if I'm just going to get better on my own? The minute you wonder if there's somebody out there that could help me with these symptoms, start making some phone calls. That is my answer to it. So I really appreciate the work that the people have done to put numbers and codes and language around all of the different kind of grief. And I am a writer, so I really believe that language matters. But I think in this instance, if we go with the definition of grief is the energy that's inside your body and your mind in reaction to loss, we can trust people to understand when that energy is getting worse instead of better. If it gets worse instead of better, if your symptoms they're traveling in the wrong direction. And I don't mean just for a day. If you have a day or a week or whatever around an anniversary, okay. I mean, in general, which is how I knew. I knew I needed treatment because I was not getting better. I was getting worse.
That is a beautiful way to explain that. I am personally very thankful because you wrestle with it, and there's always two sides of all of this, and, kind of like we're being diagnosed for feeling human feelings after a certain amount of time. However, I do understand the other side of the argument where when you are still suffering, that there's no sort of medical protocol for you to get treatment. And like you said, have it paid for it to be recognized, which we'll get to in workplaces. Like there was no official way to kind of have that. So I'm always interested in the conversation, but what a beautiful way for someone listening to personally understand it, without into sort of the optics or like, all of that side of it. So that was just so incredibly helpful.
You've reached Grief Club. Leave a message after the beep.
Hey Grief Club, it's me again. Yeah, I know you probably thought you were going to get a break from listening to me talk, but I just wanted to check in and find out how I'm doing. I mean, really, you can be really honest with me. I'm like a different Addison from the Addison that's recording in this episode because this is recorded at a different time. So you can tell me the truth. The best way to do that is to leave a review and like the podcast, but only if you like it. I really think it will help other people who need it find it. So I greatly appreciate you doing that. So the launching point of this week was all around boundaries. And so it's the first time where I sort of ask the readers and those in Grief Club with me to kind of start to look at what have we learned and what perspective have we gained and what would some meaningful boundaries that might serve us around our grief and our healing and our grief process, and how can we begin to communicate those and voice those. So first, I just wanted to invite you, whether it's anecdotal or what comes to mind, what sparks when I say that, but how boundaries became a part of your grief and you being able to show back up in such a powerful way on all these platforms.
Just you asking the question is like, I think kind of groundbreaking, right? Because when people are grieving, again, there's sort of, it's almost like drowning. Like, I don't need to hear a lot of, how I could be swimming better. I just need to not drown. I think it's really difficult for people to hear when they're grieving and they're in a lot of pain that they have to set some boundaries, because that sounds like work, and it is work. But the thing is, just because you're like a naked mole rat of vulnerability doesn't mean that you're not still responsible for making sure that you are as okay as possible. So, boundaries are really important. And the people at What's Your Grief, Lisa Williams and Eleanor, they do a gorgeous job of giving in their book and on their platform, like a whole series of boundary sentences, stems that you can use with people. Anecdotally, I had a really hard time when my mom died. My mom was incredibly Catholic, like all the ways that you can imagine. She had holy water and little Virgin Marys and all the things. She was deeply faithful and religious, and most of her friends were from her church community. So it makes perfect sense that when they came over to offer me their condolences, that they would say to me, "Your mother is in heaven with your father now." But Addison, every time I was like, "Oh, but I don't think that's true." And these are little old ladies with like, gray curly hair. And they're like, "Oh, your sweet mother is with your father now." And every time it felt like somebody was accidentally stepping on my foot and didn't know it. And so at some point, I think I was able to not be angry, but a lot of my boundaries first show up with me being pissed and saying in a not gracious way, like, "You gotta stop doing that." But I did with one of my mother's friends say, "I know you mean that with love. So this has become my best boundary stem. I know you mean well with what you are doing and saying." So first, just gently, because I know people who are trying to support grievers and they're freaked out that they're doing the wrong thing. So the minute you tell them they're doing the wrong thing, they're never going to do a thing again. So being able to say to that person, "I know you mean well. I know you are trying, and I see that. And you're accidentally stepping on my foot. So could you do this instead?" So with these little old ladies, I would say, "Oh, honey, I know you mean well. That is such a sweet thing. And also it doesn't feel great to me because I don't even know where I land with heaven. So do you have any stories that I don't know about my mom?" My mom loved to laugh. "I know you must have a story." And so then I would just give them, and sometimes people would be like, "Oh, I don't have a story." And I'd say, "That's fine." And, pull myself out of it. And other times people would have a story to the ready. So it was like, "Oh, I don't want coffee. I want apple juice. Like, here, thanks for the apple juice that I see that you have." So that boundary worked well. And when I'm working with people who are grieving, what I say is, "I know it's not fair that you should have to tell your mother-in-law to stop saying the crazy stuff that she's saying, but you do have to, not because it's your job to teach her, but it's because it's your job to take care of yourself. And if you don't, you will ruin this relationship because you will carry resentment, and she doesn't know that she's doing and saying all the wrong things."
Right.
So one right? So one thing that happens in companies when I'm going into, we have this big sort of way of talking to companies about all the ways we can talk about grief and loss, or just feelings in general. We have our main talk that people like is called Becoming Emotionally Fluent. And so we just talk about emotions in general, and then we do a part about grief and loss. But their biggest concern is, how will we know when to stop talking about grief and loss? We don't want to become like the therapists here. Do we need to hire therapists and have them on deck? And I totally appreciate that when you're saying, like, if I said to them, like, well, you need to feed your employees. Employees eat, they need to eat, you need to feed them. I could have totally appreciate how a company might be like, but how do we not become a restaurant? Like, what do you mean feed them? And emotions is a bit the same. How do we have a boundary around how much we provide? And that conversation is amazing. Because I say, what do you do now? How do you approach a griever now? And I will tell you, I have yet to have a single conversation where the person says, we love what we do, it feels great. We as a company, as a C-suite, as a manager, we just think we are landing it with our employees. What they say is, well, a few years ago, somebody said that it would be good if we did this. I sat in this meeting. I've said this a number of times, but I sat in this meeting with a team, such a lovely team. And the CEO said very proudly, well, we send a lot of stuff when there's a bereavement. And I just caught the eye, because it was on Zoom. I caught the eye of the woman in HR. And I was like, wait a minute, what's that look? And it turns out that one of the things that they sent was it's a huge corporation, was the same basket as you would get of flowers and fruit and stuff that you would get when you were signing on as an employee. So when you sign on as an employee, you get like a fruit basket and flowers. And when your wife dies, you get the exact same fruit basket and flowers. Can you imagine? And the CEO went white. He had no idea that was what was happening. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was like one of those corporate things where it was like, you have to use this vendor. You can only spend this much money. It was like but within 20 minutes, they came up with a better plan. And it didn't involve just letting the employees take as many days as they want, which is what people are afraid of when you begin the conversation. Well, how will we know what to do? You will know what to do. And it's not going to be able to be the same for everyone. That's what they want. Everybody wants just tell us how many days. It can't work like that. You have to trust your team, including the griever, or what you will get is someone who comes back to work too soon. I had an example of a gentleman who many members of his family died. He was in an accident. He was the executor. His company gave 5 days, which is actually pretty generous for companies, if you can believe that. And then he ended up taking every other vacation day to do all the executor stuff. And his company wasn't even aware that that's what he did, but he was thinking about leaving because he felt so minimized. He felt that this huge tragedy had been minimized, and his company felt like, we gave him some time off. We sent him cards. We asked him how he was doing. Like, we did a great job. But you can only be doing a great job if the person who has experienced the bereavement and the loss says you did a great job. You as the employee, as the employer, don't get to decide you're doing a great job.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. I mean, as somebody who, if anybody's listening in a position of leadership as well, just like at the time of my father's suicide, I mean, the bereavement leave was generally 2 days. That's what everybody who's in full-time got. I was the executor of my father's estate. It was very complicated. I inherited essentially a divorce. And it went on for 5 years. 5 years.
That's I absolutely believe you.
All that stuff, and it went on, and it's full-time work sometimes, when you really get into that stuff with, all the financials and everything. But it really is kind of, silly that And you would think maybe it would start to mimic in some ways. I mean, not at that same level, but when you think about what maternity leave looks like or parental leave looks like of when welcoming in life,
Yeah.
in parting with life, it's 2 days versus 18 months or 2 days versus 9 months, or depending on what
That's
it
right.
is. It's a very interesting contrast of sort of pack this up and go on your way. So I'm interested in, and we could go from this from either angle. With this idea of becoming or being a part of a more grief-informed workspace or company, if someone
Yeah.
is grieving and felt that they're not getting that, how do you suggest to begin the communication, sort of to advocate on the future grievers or the current griever, but if it's coming from the employee who's listening rather than leadership who has the power to start making shifts?
It's really tricky. That question is really tricky because I don't think that people who are currently grieving have all of their faculties.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a lot to ask for them to be doing even their own, advocating on their own behalf um, for current needs. So, most people are interfacing with their HR department, the HR department, or, their people officers, and the HR department has only a limited amount of flexibility. So what I say to grievers about anything, whether it's you're going to do your, you're the executor, and I do, this is sort of an aside, but I want to say one of the things that I advise companies to do is to partner up. There are a number of companies that's their job, is to help people go through being the executor. So so let's pretend we work for McDonald's. McDonald's can purchase a package from this company over here to help its employees, any one of them who ends up needing to go through this process. Your company is going to provide you a coach for that. Or so there are a number of things that companies can do where it's like, well, you're helping them with their mental health, but you're not becoming a mental health clinic. And what I would say is, and I say this about all of it, you need to have a team that's at least 3 people. You need, whether it's at work, I'm going to go advocate to my HR department and I'm going to bring 2 other friends, or 2 other friends at work are going to know that I'm doing it. Or I'm going to have my sister who's out in Seattle and my best friend in Boston, and they're going to know that I'm doing it. But having an accountability team and a team of people who are reflecting back to you the way that it should be and what you need. Because here's the thing, if you do not advocate for your actual needs at work, you will no longer work at that place. Because needs are needs. Needs are like food and water. And so if you need time off because you have to fly to Illinois to sort through your dad's house, you need time off because you have to fly to Illinois. And if your company says they can't do it, that is like being betrayed by your spouse. What do they mean they can't do it? What do they mean they can't do it because then they would have to do it for everyone else? That I'm not asking you to do it for everyone else. I am just talking to you about my needs. And so over and over and over again, what I see is people who go to their HR departments on their own get shut down, and there is no further conversation. They don't have an accountability team who is saying, hey, we got to go back in there. How about asking them for this instead? What about this instead? And maybe that accountability team who says, you can't work here anymore. We got to find you another job. And I don't mean go out in a blaze of glory. I know a lot of people can't just leave their jobs, but it is what ends up happening, is that the betrayal becomes too broad and too big, and people don't end up being able to stay in their grief, which is so hard, and their job, which becomes so hard. It's that missing validation and understanding. And I just, I do work with some companies that they have policies on the books, but they really want to support people who are grieving. And so at a bare minimum, even if they can't give the person the thing that they're asking for, the person leaves that office understanding why they can't get the thing that they're asking. And they are always given other choices. Other helpful choices. We can't do that, but what about this?
That. So if they did convince someone in leadership or HR to, firstly, I would say to listen to your TED Talks and your TED Talk in row, because I feel like that would be a very easy starter for them. But if they held their phone up right now to this, whatever, we're probably at the 40-minute point of this episode.
Close.
Someone in power was listening and you just had kind of 2 minutes with them. What would you say to a decision maker about creating a grief-informed workspace?
Well, I think I would say it's not as hard as you think, that there are other elements that you have taken on that are probably harder and in fact don't impact every single person quite as concretely. So you've already tackled things. So be hopeful. The issue that you are experiencing of feeling like, oh my God, I can't do this, is reflective of the culture. And what if you and your team decided that you were going to come together and try just 1% to 2% more, and all of the people that work for you then are 1% to 2% more supported in grief and loss? That trickled down across the culture. So when people are feeling like, tight, I have to grip this, it's not safe. People in leadership have, if they can put on a space of curiosity and feel hopeful, there is 1% to 2% more that you can be doing that will be impactful to your employees. So for example, there's a company that I contract with called TedX, which it's not therapy. It is not going to change, but it's a texting system. So you're my friend, Addison. I have just been bereaved. I have 2 other friends, Carla and Maggie, both of whom are really trying to support me. My company signs me up for TedX. They tell my company, Megan's dad died. The company tells TedX that, and I get a text that says, Megan, we are so sorry to hear that your dad died. We're going to send you some texts about how grief might impact you and what you might do to support yourself in grief. Are there 3 people you would also like us to send texts to? So then you're getting a text, Addison, and my 2 other friends are getting a text that say, hey, don't forget, it's Megan's dad's anniversary. Or, hey, when was the last time you checked in with Megan? Or think about taking Megan on a walk, or send Megan a little heart text today. So it's not changing the world, but TedX, which is this, is put together by Emma Payne, who went to MIT. I mean, they have a lot of data from people saying that was meaningful to them. So when companies get really freaked out, what I say is we can take the smallest bite you want. And the smallest bite could just be, I'm going to come in, we're going to have a brown bag lunch, and I'm going to tell you how grief lands in the body. And then you'll just know something you didn't know before. And then that's it. And you can stay, that'll be enough for right now. You don't have to change any of your policies. You don't have to do any of your things. But I will tell you that has never happened. It has never happened that I have brought the lecture into the company and the company's been like, we have no more questions. That's not what happens. They say, hey, can we ask you about 6 more things? And then I end up doing video series, and I end up having conversations with other, branches. And it's exciting in that way. So I think what I would say to a company is, you do not need to be afraid of this. You do harder stuff all the time.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm just sucking you dry of all the wisdom. You're just so generous. I'm just so glad you exist, because, and I say this and I mean this, I've purposely stayed, I always say this like a friend who gets it. I haven't gone on in my education or become a coach, or I'm not doing one-on-one or any of that stuff in the grief space. And there's so much of me that could go on like Aaron Brockovich style rants for grief. But I've spent 13 years in the grief arena, and I want to play in a different world. So I'm so grateful that like your purpose and your passion lies directly in this, and I can, be a champion on the side of like, I've been in the arena. Everything she's saying is absolutely right. Listen, listen to this, and it will shift the world. And when you said, it won't change their whole world, like those simple texts, but it would change the world that I was living in, some of these things are so small and so effective. And I would think that if leadership and just employees and colleagues in general, not even in a hierarchy system, understood more about grief, lived in these grief-informed workspaces, like you're saying, boundaries would also just be so much more accepted and understood.
That's right.
Makes sense to them when they come up. Of course, no text after this time. You need that time for your healing, or whatever it is, or I won't be on Slack during this time, or whatever it is. Like, I know for me, like, grief and driving didn't mix. Like, I used to be able to talk on the phone while driving, and then it was like, this isn't safe anymore because I've got to focus, with the trauma elements and whatnot. So I just love everything that you have brought to the table today. And as we wind down on this show, one thing I always do is just bringing up finding the funny. So I'm just curious, where do you find the funny in all of this, or what's making you laugh these days? Go-to comedian can be anything. What's that spark?
Well, so, my mom had a tremendous sense of humor. I mean, tremendous sense of humor, like, pull prank kind of sense of humor. And, I have 5 brothers and sisters, and a couple of whom really also have my mother's sense of humor. And so all the ridiculous clips, particularly the ones where people are falling, they're falling on ice, they're falling off their bikes, they're falling on skis, and ones that involve little children saying swears. Those are, and I used this during the pandemic. I said to people, like, can you please send me and 2 other people the funniest things that you've seen on the internet, just because laughter is just an incredible way to move energy through the body. And so right now my sister is obsessed. I don't know the name of the account, with this little boy who I think he's either Irish or Scottish. He he wears little glasses, and he's always saying the most ridiculous things to his mother about it, like, very deeply, sincerely. He's very sweet, but they're ridiculous. There's often some swears involved, and that I just find a lot of delight in. And what I love is, like, I don't go on Instagram. I probably pop it open 2 or 3 times a day. And when I do, there's like the little mailbox, and I can see there's like 5 or 6, which means I've got 5 or 6 videos from my people who are making me sort of remember the inanity of what used to make my mom laugh. And it really does. It feels like a prayer or a song, it's just, it harkens to something so important.
Yeah. It's like, it's just at that point where it's like, this is not just a meme. Like, this is acknowledging so much while also making me laugh in the exact way that that I'm missing, or that it's safe to laugh with you. I have that with my older sister, like, where it's like, just other people think it's just evil gallows humor, but it's our safe place. We get to live there. We do live there. We can laugh there. So I love hearing that. And one day I'm going to have to get an expert on to explain to us why psychologically it is so funny to watch people fall or children swear, because it's just everything. It's like, I got to send it
but everyone finds it funny. Like, you look, and there's been 6 million people who have laughed at this video, and there's something irreverent about it. And I don't think it's funny if they fall and they're like really injured, although sometimes maybe it is a little bit funny, but mostly it's only funny when it's like stupid, it's like ridiculous that they're falling. And I love that kind of humor. And I love that you asked the question about, I often ask it, like, what's bringing you joy? Because grief is so intense on this one side of the spectrum. And we want to live a full life where grief isn't the only thing that's defining us. Right. And so being able to, like, keep in your consciousness, even you asking me that question and me remembering that I laughed twice today at videos, I'm like, oh, I'm doing a good job. I'm living out there. I'm not just grieving. I'm doing life. So I love that. I love that question.
Great contrast check-in. If people want to find more of you, which I have a feeling they're going to after the last, where can they do that?
So I am at, the easiest might be to Google Grief is My Side Hustle, because it doesn't have any hard spelling. That is the name of my podcast. You'll find my website that way. And you can always, if you want to get in touch with me, you'll really get in touch with my assistant, but it will get to me you can click on that there. I love having people follow me on Instagram because I try to be as ridiculous as possible and as serious as possible on Instagram. So I post a lot of where I'm talking and what I'm doing, and that's at Meghan Riordan Jarvis. And I don't tweet or Twitter because I just like don't even know how to do that stuff. And as I said, my podcast is called Grief is My Side Hustle, and it comes out on Thursdays, and that you can find anywhere that you listen to, your podcasts. And the books are going to come out. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll get the dates. It's a while from now still, but we're working on it.
To put that out there when it comes, and I'm booked in, so I'll be.
You're coming to me next. I love it.
I have to do a little mini commercial so that when that comes out too, people know to hop over and
a crossover.
Well, we're losing light.
I know. I can't believe how dark did it get in here. I'm in this house that has
darker externally as you've lit me up internally. So
I'm so sorry. Now you can't even see me. I didn't light myself because there was so much light in this. I did a call last night at this time, and there was so much light in here, it created glare. But now I'm like, I look like one of those people who it's a whistleblower and you don't want to show my face.
Yeah, I'm going to start to ask those questions. All right. I'll let you have the last word. I'm going to check out with giddy as my one word. What's one word for checking out for you?
Right now, I just feel really like satisfied and content.
Love it. Thanks for being here today. Well, Grief Club, that's the show. If you enjoyed it, please let us know by liking and leaving a review. This will help as many people who may need what we're talking about find it the fastest. Remember to honor the journey, and when that gets tough, find the funny.